March 24th, 1945. The skies over the Rhine River, Germany. The air is thick with the smoke of a dying empire. On the eastern periphery of the Allied advance, a team of Soviet military liaisons is stationed near the front lines, technically allies, but quietly tasked by Moscow with a singular, secret directive. Observe the American war machine. Assess its strengths. Find its weaknesses. Major Grigory Volkov stands in a ruined church tower, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He is watching the German defensive line, a formidable wall of 88mm flak cannons and entrenched infantry. The Germans are desperate, their radar networks sweeping the sky, waiting for the inevitable roar of American heavy bombers. The Luftwaffe is grounded, but the German listening posts are still sharp. They know the sound of a B-17 Fortress. They know the radar signature of a C-47 transport train. But on this morning, the German radar screens are confusingly empty. The acoustic locators, usually screaming with the drone of engines, pick up nothing but the wind. Then, the impossible happens. 5 miles behind the German heavy fortifications in a zone that should be secure, explosions erupt. Volkov watches in stunned silence as American light tanks, the M22 Locusts, and heavy jeeps suddenly swarm out of the tree lines, tearing through the German rear guard. Volkov lowers his binoculars. He grabs the field telephone to his counterpart in intelligence. "Report," he barks. "How did they get there? Where are the tracks?" "There are no tracks, Major." The voice crackles back, trembling. "They did not drive through the lines." "Then they were dropped," Volkov insists. "But where were the planes?" "The German radar did not light up. We heard no engines. You cannot drop a tank from the sky without a heavy transport fleet that screams like a thunderstorm." "We saw nothing, Major. Just shadows. Silent shadows gliding over the treetops." The Soviet team is paralyzed by the implication. They are witnessing a military force that has apparently mastered the art of invisibility. To the rigid Soviet mind, obsessed with heavy armor and massive artillery barrages, this makes no sense. A tank is heavy. It is loud. It requires logistics. Yet the Americans have just placed an armored column behind enemy lines without triggering a single acoustic alarm or radar warning. If you are enjoying this dive into the hidden history of military technology, please subscribe to Cold War Impact for more declassified mysteries. Back in Moscow, the reports from the Rhine are met with cold skepticism by the Kremlin. The Stavka, the Soviet high command, reads Volkov's dispatches with growing unease. They are looking at a map of post-war Europe, a map where the Red Army relies on static defensive lines and heavy radar curtains to protect the motherland. If the Americans possess a technology that allows them to bypass radar entirely to deliver armor and troops silently, like ghosts, then the Iron Curtain is obsolete before it is even built. The Soviet air defense doctrine is based on detecting metal and heat. They have no defense against silence. They have no defense against wood and canvas. The panic begins to set in. This is not just a tactical victory against the Nazis, it is a strategic threat to the Soviet Union. The Americans have found a loophole in the physics of war. Volkov receives a new, urgent order from Moscow. Identify the vehicle. Find the wreckage. We must know how they made gravity silent. The hunt for the phantom machine begins. The smoke from the Rhine crossing had barely settled when the Soviet technical teams descended upon the fields near Wesel. Major Volkov moved with a frantic energy, his boots sinking into the churned mud of the German countryside. He was not looking for survivors. He was looking for the ghost that had delivered them. The reports from the forward units were maddeningly inconsistent. Infantry commanders swore they had been overrun by tanks that appeared from thin air. German prisoners, eyes hollow with shell shock, babbled about silent birds that blocked out the sun before vomiting jeeps and artillery onto the grass. Volkov's team located the first crash site near a shattered tree line. The area was cordoned off by NKVD troops, their submachine guns pointed outward, guarding the debris as if it were a crashed extraterrestrial craft. Volkov ducked under the cordon tape and approached the wreckage. He expected to see the twisted aluminum and burning magnesium of a heavy transport plane, something like a C-47 or a massive B-24. He expected the smell of high-octane aviation fuel and the complex tangle of hydraulic lines and radial engines. Instead, he smelled wet canvas and splintered plywood. "This is it?" Volkov asked, kicking a piece of torn fabric that fluttered in the cold wind. "This is the machine that bypassed the Luftwaffe's radar?" "It is, Major," a junior technical officer replied, looking up from a notepad. He looked pale. We have analyzed the debris field. There are no engines. There are no fuel tanks. There are no electronics. There is barely any metal at all. Volkov walked around the crumpled fuselage. It was immense, a gaping maw of a cargo hold that had been ripped open upon impact. Inside the fractured ribs of the craft, he saw the heavy tie-down chains, snapped taut. The floor was reinforced with honeycomb plywood, crushed under the weight of whatever massive load it had carried. "Measure the cargo bay," Volkov ordered. The technician hesitated. "We already have, sir. It is wide enough for a jeep, or a howitzer, or a light tank." Volkov froze. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The Americans weren't using new engines. They weren't using advanced electronic jamming to blind the radar. They were using the oldest trick in the book, but they had scaled it up to an industrial monstrosity. He looked at the twisted steel tubing that formed the frame. It was crude. It was cheap. It was disposable. "They are throwing away aircraft," Volkov muttered. "They build them, fly them once, crash them and walk away." The investigation deepened over the next 48 hours, and with it, the paranoia in Moscow spiked. The technical reports reached the Kremlin, describing a ghost fleet that was invisible to magnetic detection and acoustic locators. The Soviet air defense doctrine of the 1945s was built on a specific assumption: threats are loud and threats are metal. A bomber formation creates a massive radar reflection. A transport fleet creates a distinct acoustic rumble that can be heard from miles away. But this was a strategic nightmare. General Sudoplatov, reviewing the intelligence in Moscow, slammed his fist on the table. "How do we shoot down a cloud of wood and cloth? Our magnetic fuses will not trigger. Our acoustic locators will hear nothing until they are on top of us." The wrong conclusions began to circulate through the Soviet high command. Paranoia breeds invention. Some intelligence officers argued that the Americans must have developed a silent engine, a propulsion system that dampened acoustic waves. Others theorized that the gliders were coated in a special radar-absorbing paint, a precursor to the stealth myths that would haunt them decades later. They could not accept the simplicity of the solution. They believed the Americans had solved the physics of sound. Volkov, back in the field, interviewed a captured German radar operator. The man was shivering, nursing a cup of tea. "Tell me," Volkov demanded through a translator, "what did you see on the scope?" The German laughed, a dry, bitter sound. "See? We saw nothing. The screen was clear. We were drinking coffee, waiting for the bombers. Then the ground shook. We looked out the window, and they were already landing. Hundreds of them, falling like leaves. Did you hear the tow planes?" Volkov pressed. "Miles away," the German replied. "They released them far back. By the time the gliders reached us, they were just whispering in the wind. You cannot shoot what you cannot hear, Major." This was the terrifying truth that Volkov had to put in his final report. The Americans had weaponized silence. They had created a delivery system that turned the enemy's reliance on technology against them. The more advanced the German radar became, the more useless it was against a threat made of canvas and air. The Soviet leadership looked at the map of their own expanding borders. They imagined these silent leviathans drifting over the steppes, dropping saboteurs and armor behind the Red Army lines, undetectable, unstoppable. A legend was born in the files of the GRU. They called it the Silent Cavalry. And they were convinced that the Americans were building a fleet of thousands, ready to drift into Soviet airspace the moment the war with Germany ended. But Volkov, staring at the shattered remains of the cockpit, noticed something else. A small manufacturing plate riveted to the steel tube frame. It didn't bear the mark of a massive military contractor like Boeing or Lockheed. It bore the name of a refrigerator company. "Who are these people?" Volkov whispered. "Who builds an invasion fleet out of refrigerator parts?" While Major Volkov was kicking at plywood shards in a muddy German field, searching for secret propulsion systems and advanced radar jamming technology, the truth of the Phantom Fleet was being forged 4,000 miles away. It wasn't happening in a high-security underground laboratory in Los Alamos, nor was it hidden behind the barbed wire of a skunkworks aerospace facility. The impossible weapon that had paralyzed the German defenses and baffled Soviet intelligence was being built in a refrigerator factory in Greenville, Michigan. This was the genius of the American war effort, a genius not of complexity, but of brutal, overwhelming simplicity. The year was 1942. The United States Army Air Forces faced a logistical nightmare. They needed a way to deliver heavy equipment jeeps, 75mm pack howitzers, ammunition trailers, and combat troops directly onto the battlefield, behind enemy lines, without the disastrous scattering effect of parachute drops. Paratroopers were effective, but they landed with only what they could carry. They were light infantry, vulnerable to armor. To break a fortified line, you needed immediate heavy support. General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the Army Air Forces, looked at the German success with gliders early in the war and ordered an immediate American counterpart. But the American aviation industry was already choked. Every ounce of aluminum, every aircraft engine, and every skilled riveter was already committed to building B-17 bombers and P-51 fighters. There was no capacity left to build a massive fleet of transport planes. The solution was the Waco CG-4 Ampères, and it was a masterclass in desperation engineering. The designers at the Waco Aircraft Company in Troy, Ohio, looked at the constraints. No aluminum? Fine. They would use steel tubing for the frame and wood for the wings. No engines? Perfect. That meant no fuel tanks, no complex wiring, and no fire suppression systems. No skilled aviation mechanics? They didn't need them. The blueprints were sent out not to aircraft manufacturers, but to furniture makers, piano factories, and refrigerator plants. The Gibson Refrigerator Company, which had spent decades making iceboxes, suddenly found itself converting its assembly lines to build the fuselages of combat aircraft. Steinway & Sons, famous for their grand pianos, began stitching together wings. This was the secret project the Soviets feared so intensely. It wasn't a singular superweapon, it was the total mobilization of American civilian industry. The Ghost Fleet was made of the same materials as an American living room: canvas, glue, and wood. But the engineering, while crude in materials, was aerodynamically brilliant. The CG-4 Ampères was a boxy, ugly beast, but it was stable. It had a massive nose section that was hinged at the top. When the glider landed, the pilots could pull a cable, and the entire front of the aircraft would swing upward, allowing a jeep or a howitzer to roll out of the nose in seconds. It was the world's first drive-through assault vehicle. The invisibility that Volkov and the Germans had encountered was a byproduct of this low-tech design. The canvas skin was transparent to radar waves. The wooden wings absorbed rather than reflected the electromagnetic pulses. Without a spinning metal propeller or a hot engine block, the glider had almost no radar cross-section. It was the ancestor of stealth technology, achieved not through billion-dollar composites, but through the lack of anything substantial to detect. However, the machine was only half the equation. The other half was the pilot. The American military designated them glider pilots, but the men who flew them had a darker nickname for their crates: flying coffins. These men were a unique breed in the history of warfare. They were the only pilots in the Army Air Forces who had no parachutes. There was no point in wearing one. If the glider was hit, you couldn't bail out. You had to ride it down. Furthermore, they were the only pilots whose job description technically ended the moment they successfully landed. Once they hit the ground, they grabbed a Thompson submachine gun and became infantry. The training was rushed and dangerous. They learned to fly in converted light planes, practicing dead stick landings over and over again. They learned to read the wind, to judge the glide ratio of a brick, and to land a fully loaded aircraft in a field no larger than a football pitch, often while under fire. The operational doctrine that terrified the Germans and confused the Soviets was known as the double TOW. C-47 transport aircraft would take off towing not one, but two of these heavy gliders on nylon ropes. The Armada would climb to altitude, a slow, straining train of engines and canvas. As they approached the target zone, usually miles from the drop site to stay out of anti-aircraft range, the C-47 pilots would signal the release. This was the moment of transformation. Inside the glider, the pilot would pull the release lever. The heavy nylon tow rope would snap away, recoiling toward the tow plane. Suddenly, the roar of the C-47 engines would fade. The vibrations stopped. The glider would enter its element: silence. From the ground, the enemy heard the transport planes turn back. They would assume the raid was over, or that it was a high-altitude bombing run passing them by. They would relax. Meanwhile, thousands of feet above them, the silent cavalry was beginning its descent. The pilots would trim their aircraft, trading altitude for speed. They could glide for miles, drifting on the wind, correcting their course with silent inputs. They became birds of prey. The approach to the landing zone, the LZ, was a terrifying rush. The pilots had one chance. There was no go-around. There was no throttle to power up and try again. If you overshot the field, you crashed into the trees. If you undershot, you stalled and fell out of the sky. In the case of the Rhine crossing Operation Varsity, which Volkov had witnessed, the scale was apocalyptic. It wasn't just a few gliders. It was the largest single-day airborne drop in history. Over 900 Waco gliders, along with larger British Hamilcar gliders carrying heavy Tetrarch tanks and American M22 Locust tanks, were released simultaneously. The acoustic camouflage was absolute. The gliders approached at a steep angle, diving aggressively to build speed and minimize their exposure to small arms fire. They leveled out at treetop height, swooping over the German heads before the enemy even knew they were there. The explosions Volkov saw behind the lines were the gliders crash landing, which was their standard arrival method. They sheared off wings on telephone poles to slow down. They skidded through fences. They slammed into barns. And the moment they stopped moving, the noses went up and the armor poured out. Back in the US, the factories were churning these disposable aircraft out at a rate of dozens per day. The cost was negligible compared to a bomber. The US could afford to build them, fill them, fly them once, and leave them rotting in a French field. This was the source of the mystery. It wasn't a scientific breakthrough in acoustics. It was a triumph of industrial logistics. The Americans had realized that in a war of attrition, a disposable airplane made of furniture parts that could deliver a tank was more dangerous than a precision bomber that couldn't. While the Soviets were obsessing over the theoretical physics of the threat, the Americans were simply overwhelming the enemy with wood, canvas, and guts. The Phantom was real, but it was far cruder and far more effective than the Kremlin could possibly imagine. But the Soviets were about to uncover the full extent of this capability, and the realization would force a confrontation that would shape their Cold War paranoia for decades. The fog of war did not lift immediately after the surrender of Germany. For the Soviet intelligence apparatus, the immediate post-war period was a frantic scramble to loot the intellectual corpse of the Third Reich. While the Americans hunted for rocket scientists like Werner von Braun, the GRU teams under officers like Major Volkov were hunting for the explanation of the silent cavalry. The breakthrough did not come from a captured prototype or a defecting scientist. It came from a stack of paper found in a muddy administrative tent near an American airfield in Bavaria. It was a logistics manifest. Volkov sat in a requisitioned German manor house, the papers spread out before him under the harsh light of an electric lamp. He was reading the production costs and deployment schedules for the 9th Troop Carrier Command. He read the numbers once. He cleaned his glasses. He read them again. "This cannot be accurate," he murmured to his aide. "Look at this unit cost." The document listed the procurement price of a Waco CG-4 Amperes glider. It was approximately $18,000. In contrast, a B-29 Superfortress bomber cost over $600,000. But it wasn't the price that stopped Volkov's heart. It was the deployment status. Next to thousands of serial numbers, there was a simple, stamped designation: expendable. The realization washed over him, cold and absolute. The Soviets had spent months terrified of a stealth superweapon, searching for a technological marvel that bent the laws of physics. They had assumed the silent gliders were a precious high-tech asset, likely guarded by elite squadrons and recovered after every mission. The truth was infinitely more terrifying. The Americans did not care about the gliders. They treated aircraft like artillery shells. They treated complex flying machines like bullets. "They do not recover them," Volkov said, his voice flat. "They throw them away. They built 13,000 of them and they left them rotting in the fields." This was the shock moment. It wasn't a shock of technological superiority, but of economic omnipotence. The Soviet Union, struggling to rebuild its shattered industries where every truck and every rifle was accounted for and cherished, could not comprehend a nation so wealthy that it could build an entire air force out of furniture parts and then abandon it in the mud after a single use. The investigation took a darker turn as the Soviets interviewed captured German officers who had faced the gliders. They learned of an even more impossible capability, something that defied Soviet understanding of aerodynamics. A German colonel, captured near Wesel, explained it to Volkov. "It wasn't just that they landed," the German said. "It was that they could leave, without engines." Volkov leaned in. "Explain." "We saw it happen," the German insisted. "A glider would be on the ground full of wounded men. A transport plane, a C-47, would fly over it, not landing, just flying low. A hook would dangle from the plane. It would catch a rope on the ground. and snap, the glider was ripped into the sky. 0 to 100 miles per hour in seconds, like a fish caught on a line. This was the glider snatch system, a capability the Soviets had assumed was impossible. The Americans could retrieve their spies, their wounded, and their VIPs from behind enemy lines without the recovery plane ever touching the ground. It turned the entire Soviet rear area into a porous, indefensible zone. The wrong conclusion of Part 2, that the Americans had a new engine, was replaced by the horrifying reality of American ingenuity. They solved the problem of extraction not with vertical takeoff jets, which didn't exist yet, but with a winch, a hook, and a nylon rope. It was cowboy engineering, and it worked flawlessly. The Soviet High Command was forced to confront a new strategic reality. Their radar network, the Davina systems and early warning arrays they were pouring rubles into, were designed to spot high-altitude metallic bombers. They were looking up. But the Americans had proven they could come in low, slow, and silent. The Soviet response was desperate and ultimately futile in the face of this specific threat. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Kremlin poured resources into developing the Yak-14, their own heavy glider. They tried to copy the American doctrine, but they failed to understand the core component, the pilot. The Americans had a culture of general aviation farm boys who grew up fixing tractors and flying crop dusters. They had a pool of daredevils willing to fly a plywood box into a tree for their country. The Soviet system, rigid and centralized, could not mass-produce that kind of improvised courage. Their glider program was stiff, overly regulated, and ultimately abandoned. So, they turned to defense. They needed a way to shoot down the silent cavalry. This led to a frantic shift in air defense priorities. If radar couldn't see the wood and canvas, they needed eyes. The Soviets expanded their visual observer corps, thousands of men and women with binoculars standing in towers across the Eastern Bloc, listening for the whisper of wind over wings. They also realized their new jet interceptors were useless against this threat. In 1950, Soviet pilots began flying the MiG-15. It was a marvel of speed, capable of breaking the sound barrier in a dive. But when they ran simulations against slow-moving, low-flying targets like gliders or prop-driven transports, they faced a physics problem. A MiG-15 flying at 600 miles per hour cannot easily engage a glider flying at 80 miles per hour just above the treetops. The closing speed is too high. The pilot has a fraction of a second to aim and fire before he overshoots. If he slows down too much to aim, the heavy swept-wing jet stalls and crashes. Volkov watched a test interception in 1951. A MiG-15 screamed over a mock airfield, trying to target a wooden biplane, acting as a glider simulator. The jet roared past, its cannons tearing up the ground half a mile ahead of the target. "Too fast," Volkov noted in his logbook. "We have built a sword to kill a dragon, but we are fighting a swarm of mosquitoes." The Americans had inadvertently created an anti-access weapon simply by being primitive. The sheer slowness of the glider was its defense. By the time the Soviets fully understood the threat, the Cold War had shifted. The Americans moved on to helicopters and jet transports, but the trauma of the silent cavalry remained. It left a permanent scar on the Soviet military psyche, a deep-seated paranoia about low-altitude, slow-moving penetrators that radar could not see. This paranoia would fester for decades, driving them to build thousands of distinct, short-range anti-aircraft guns like the ZSU-234 Shilka, specifically to shred anything that flew low and slow. They were building a shield against a ghost that had already retired. Volkov closed the file on the American glider project. The mystery was solved. There was no magic engine. There was no invisible paint. There was just a willingness to build cheap, fly dangerous, and overwhelm the enemy with the sheer weight of American industry. "We cannot copy this," Volkov wrote in his final summary to the Kremlin, "because we cannot afford to throw airplanes away." The hangars were empty. The factories in Michigan and Ohio went back to making refrigerators and pianos. The vast armada of 13,909 Waco CG-4 Amperes gliders, the largest fleet of silent aircraft ever assembled in human history, simply vanished. Most were stripped of their instruments and burned in giant pyres across the fields of France and Holland. The metal frames were melted down, the canvas rotted in the rain. The Americans did not preserve them because they did not need to. They had proven their point. This mass destruction of their own fleet provides the killer statistic that defined the Cold War balance of power. Of the nearly 14,000 gliders built, fewer than a dozen survive in museums today. The United States treated a fleet larger than the entire air force of most nations as single-use packaging. For the Soviet Union, this was the most terrifying lesson of all. It wasn't about the gliders themselves. It was about what the gliders represented. The Soviet economy was a rigid, centralized machine. It struggled to produce enough trucks, enough radios, and enough boots. Every piece of equipment had to be accounted for, repaired, and used until it fell apart. The idea of disposable warfare, of building a complex aircraft, flying it once, and lighting it on fire, was an economic impossibility for Moscow. They realized they were facing an enemy that did not play by the rules of scarcity. The Americans fought with the weapon of abundance. Major Volkov's report on the silent cavalry was filed away in the deep archives of the GRU, but its influence rippled through Soviet military doctrine for the next 40 years. The paranoia about low and slow intruders never left them. Because they couldn't match the American ability to swarm the skies with cheap, invisible aircraft, the Soviets became obsessed with creating an impenetrable wall of lead. This fear directly influenced the design of the ZSU-234 Shilka, a terrifying four-barreled anti-aircraft tank introduced in the 1960s. Its radar was specifically tuned to find low-flying, slow-moving targets that traditional missiles would miss. They spent billions of rubles building a defense network to stop a ghost that had already retired. But the ultimate irony, the final poetic proof that the Soviets never truly solved the riddle of the silent glider, arrived decades later, near the very end of the Cold War. On May 28, 1987, the Soviet Union possessed the most sophisticated air defense network on the planet. They had thousands of surface-to-air missiles, hundreds of MiG-29 aircraft and Su-27 interceptors, and a radar coverage that overlapped 3 times over. They were ready for the SR-71 Blackbird. They were ready for the B-1 Lancer. They were ready for World War III. But they weren't ready for a teenager in a rented Cessna. Matthias Rust, a 19-year-old German amateur pilot, flew a small, single-engine plane from Helsinki directly into the heart of Moscow. He landed in Red Square, practically at the front door of the Kremlin. How did he do it? How did a slow, loud civilian plane defeat the might of the Soviet superpower? The answer lay in the radar filters. The Soviet radar operators had set their systems to ignore slow-moving objects. They had notched their filters to reject anything flying under a certain speed, assuming it was a bird, a cloud, or a glitch. They were looking for the Mark II bombers and the hypersonic missiles. They were so obsessed with the high-tech threat that they had blinded themselves to the low-tech reality. Rust's Cessna was the spiritual successor to the Waco glider. It was slow, it was simple, and it was invisible to a system designed to fight the future. The incident decapitated the Soviet military leadership. Gorbachev fired his defense minister and the head of the air defense forces. It was a humiliation that signaled the end of the Soviet myth of invincibility. And it proved that Major Volkov's fears in 1945 were correct. The Soviet system was a giant clad in steel armor, holding a massive shield, staring at the horizon for a dragon. Meanwhile, the enemy could simply walk past them in canvas shoes. The legacy of the silent gliders is not just a footnote in World War II history. It is the origin story of American stealth philosophy. The Waco glider proved that you don't need to be faster or higher to survive. You just need to be undetectable. Decades later, when the Americans unveiled the F-117 Nighthawk, the world marveled at its angular, radar-absorbing shape. But the core concept remained the same as the plywood glider. If they can't see you, they can't kill you. The Cold War was often defined by nuclear posturing and the space race titans throwing rockets at the moon. But the real dominance was established in the mud of the Rhine, where the Americans showed they could turn a refrigerator factory into an air force, flood the sky with silent ghosts, and then walk away from the wreckage without looking back.